And hello everyone, my name's Laura and welcome to webinar 14 of the Lockdown Lunch and Learn webinar series. The title of this one is Keeping Positive Through Adversity. What can we learn from the extraordinary emerging world of machine intelligence that might help us have a think about how we can upgrade, refresh, overhaul, reboot our own thinking processes in these extraordinary times for which there were no training course available this time 12 months ago to properly equip us for this stuff. So without further ado, I'll start sharing the slides. And hopefully what you found useful, for those of you either watching live or watching it as a recap, is by putting some tried and tested topics like positive thinking, which has been around for decades, and just reworking some of these things in some new quirky ways can sometimes unlock some new fresh ways of thinking that we might find useful. So the title of this one is Keeping Positive Through Adversity. And here we have one of my favourite pictures of all time. It's a little image from Disney's Big Hero 6 film. It was the highest grossing film of 2014. And I found it really interesting as someone who is in my 40s, just how different the Disney stories surrounding technology are compared to when I was younger, being raised on things like Terminator and how technology was the big bad evil, etc. So these sessions are designed to keep ourselves focused, flexible and empowered. So I'm going to ask Alexa on this. Alexa, define positive thinking.
Positive thinking is usually defined as focusing on thoughts of success as a strategy for achievement.
Focusing on thoughts of success, strategy, right, got it, okay. I'm going to ask her a follow-up question. Alexa, how do I remain positive when there's so much going on and I don't know what my economic outlook is in the future and no one's doing what I ask them to do?
I don't know that one.
Right, okay. So machines can take us so far, but at some point we've got to kind of make some of this stuff up ourselves because we are yet to be able to Google the case study out of this one. So let's have a think about how we can view this as a positive rather than getting kind of caught up in the negativity of it. So isn't it been interesting that through these times, rather than signalling the end of humanity as we knew it, machines have actually enabled us to maintain some consistency in our human moments. Just think of all those catch-ups that you've had through the screen that you maybe wouldn't be doing this time last year. So these are transformational times. So many of us are finding that the computer is the hug, whether that is a virtual embrace or even just feeling uplifted after we've had the opportunity to sort of connect with someone. Equally, it's also highlighting the stuff that we are missing and yearning for, shows that technology alone cannot replace it all. And actually, some of the things that we are finding we're having to force ourselves to think positive about. Being positive itself is the task for many of us right now, to be able to stay well enough, to be able to be productive and proactive as and when the scenario evolves around us. And probably what we don't want to be doing is emerging like the evil Vera robot from Superman 3 in 1983, which apparently, looking online, is the stuff of nightmares for many a young child at the time. We don't want to be emerging from lockdown unable to think in a human way because we've been so addicted to our screens. So is there a way that we can look at the best of both worlds, viewing the old world of positivity and human performance through the new world of AI and computer performance? Could that give us some interesting things? Because a machine never gives up. So conversely, are there some things that we can learn from machine learning that might get us to think about something in a bit of a different way? So practical tips for keeping positive through adversity. These are, as always, the intention is a great space to learn. Ditch the stuff that doesn't work for you, keep the stuff that does. It's all in the pursuit of the joy of learning and keeping our brains stimulated and always rooted in commercial practicality. So how could we apply some of this stuff immediately after this webinar? We'll focus on 3 objectives, practical suggestions to guide your thinking. One size fits one. So again, it's about making your own way with this. It's just some things serving up to get you to think about how stuff might work for you, and help us to thrive whilst working from home, no matter how makeshift or temporary our current situation. So today's objectives, we're going to look at just how much influence does our thought process have on our day-to-day experience. What could be some frameworks for handling challenge and difficulty in a positive way? It's extraordinary when you look at how computers work that actually can shine a light on maybe how we could reframe adversity, and some tips for keeping our brains in optimum condition now and for the future. Okay, so here we go. Now, if we were to channel the fox mindset about this, forever learning, overnight our skills may needed to have changed from hunting to foraging. A fox is always on the front foot because it has deep in its survival spirit the fact that adaptation and adjusting is the way that it is key to thrive. Unlike the poor panda, who is really cute and we love them, but they're kind of stuck with this lumbering frame and inability to handle diversity. They can only eat bamboo. So it doesn't really matter how positive I was this time last year when everything was maybe in a different condition. It's how I'm able to have the skill to remain positive now, and how there might be some adjustments that might be worth me having to think about, so I can still keep equipped and thriving in the decade ahead. For we are only 4 months into a brand new decade. So, objective 1, how do thoughts influence our day-to-day experience? Well, I thought it might be quite useful to look at what Alan Turing was talking about human thinking processes all those decades ago. So from 1951, his aim was a computer would deserve to be called intelligent if it could deceive a human into believing that it was a human. So the thinking process and how we process that is key behind some of this stuff behind intelligent machines. So, let's go back to the basics. Why the link between machines and humans? Well, right from the get-go, machine intelligence was modelled on the human brain. Even language like neural networks, action potential, memory storage, all of those language has been used based on human brain as kind of a metaphor for it. So it's been the inspiration right from the dawn anyway. So therefore, could there be, as I said at the start, some lessons that we could almost learn in reverse? So first things first, we've got this kind of machine brain interface thinking that's going on. I think it's going to be fascinating over this next decade where all this takes us. And actually your neural networks, on the left-hand side, we've got the biological one, that's millions of these inside our brains. And then we've got the artificial one, of which there'll be millions of these all around us that are processing and analysing all the data that throws up the exact suggestion on Netflix that software program believes that I'm going to enjoy. And in fact, there's so much interest around this that Elon Musk's Neuralink business this year is going to be having its very first human guinea pig, human trial in its N1 implant, its Neuralink implant, which is where on my phone screen, I'll be able to see all the neural processing going on within my brain. So it's two-way. What can I put into there that can then stimulate a thought process in my brain? And what can my phone show me that's going on inside my brain? Big stuff. But the more you kind of read into it, the more you realise that actually a lot of this stuff has been going on in neurosurgery anyway, in terms of that brain-computer kind of link, using the electricity as the sort of circuit with it. So if, according to Wikipedia, we have up to 70,000 thoughts a day, not all of these are going to be automatically optimal. And research suggests that 95% of the daily thoughts that we have are repetitive thoughts. And of those repeated thoughts, 80% are negative. So our senses are like our input sensors. So if we were going to think like a machine, the question you'd be asking that machine is, what is the data that you are taking in? So what am I looking at right now? And what am I listening to? And the ultimate question is this useful? Otherwise, a computer would discard that data because it wouldn't be matching the program that it was set out to achieve. So if machine intelligence has been based on human brains anyway, what can we in turn learn from how a machine would look at something? And what it would look at would be the quality of that data that it is consuming each day. If we have a look at what does a machine do with data, So if you have a look at that little pussycat's nose there, can you see the little mouth? You just know that that is a cat's mouth. You just know that because immediately you see that picture of the full cat there and you can infer from that tiny bit of knowledge, yep, that's a full cat that sits there. Interestingly, in terms of how a computer infers, is it goes left, right, left, right, left, right. And it does a predictability. So it says, well, there's an 82% chance that that little pixel there is a cat, but there's also a 2% chance that it's a hat. So a computer wouldn't rush to a judgment. It would make a prediction based on what it sees and the level of certainty it has. Now, there might be quite something interesting here that we could take when challenging our thoughts. Because as of November 2017, there are more connected devices than humans on the planet. And the prediction is by mid this decade, there'll be about 25 billion connected devices. That's not light bulbs talking to sensors. That's things with a SIM card being able to generate data, talking to other things that can generate data. So much so that there are a few airports around the world now that have an off-site air traffic control tower. Such is the stability around machines and using images to be able to make decisions. And actually, we're already being outperformed in some areas. So if you ask a human to look at that busy street scene and then another similar picture, and if you're asked to spot 50 differences, we would find that really tricky, whereas a machine would be able to do that because it scans left, right, left, right, left, right. And the benefit of a human looking at that picture would be a human would be able to infer some stories from it. But that also is potentially our fatal flaw. Sometimes we infer some stories from that slightly random comment someone said on a phone call earlier on, and we can then suddenly invent a whole picture around something that might not be true. So a machine only does what it's programmed to do with the data. How am I using the data and what story am I potentially creating? So could a question that might be useful to help me is, what am I 100% sure about and what am I making up? Am I making up actually a negative story around just the tiniest bit of information that actually is impacting my ability to stay positive? And the third something to have a think about is, could creating a kill switch help keep uncontrollable thinking on more of a positive track? So if 80% of the 95% repeated thoughts that go around my head each day are potentially working against me as opposed to for me, well, how a computer programmer might look at that is they might say, well, right from the start, let's put a little bit of code in that will automatically switch off if the computer starts to get into some uncontrollable information processing. So that army of processing, if actually at some point you think, actually, potentially that's going to end into a bit of a negative, then what could we do to have an emergency stop that's in our head? And this is something that someone gave me as a skill a couple of years ago, because I had some thoughts that were going round and round and round and round in my head, and that weren't necessarily making me feel particularly positive. So it's almost having a stop, worry about it later, focus on what I do want. So if our brain is like an information processing track, actually how a computer programmer would look at that is that at the part at which the computer starts to get negative, it would have some inbuilt kill switch, they call it, to turn it off. So what could I set out for this afternoon? If I think I've got a bit of a challenging afternoon ahead of me, what's going to be my thing where I might say to myself, right, if I start thinking about that, what am I going to do to divert my attention? So it's not being in denial, but it's not following hours and hours of processing potentially a thought that is going to only make you feel more negative. So even just saying to yourself, stop, worry about it later, focus on what I do want, puts your brain onto more of an appropriate thinking track. So how do our thoughts influence our day-to-day experience? Well, our thinking is everything. And in fact, machine intelligence, all the stuff all around us, is modelled on the phenomena of the human brain. And likewise, we need quality input. So what am I looking at and what am I listening? Is it working for me or against me? If so, what might I need to switch? A machine just does what it's been programmed to do with the data. So a machine would make a prediction based on what it thinks it is. We can sometimes jump to conclusions and create all sorts of stories that aren't actually logical conclusions. So could maybe challenging the data be useful for me? So looking at something in a slightly different way. and could even create a kill switch to stop uncontrollable thinking that potentially is a negative for me. How might that be useful? And how practically we could do that is thinking, right, tomorrow, if I find myself starting to think about this, what am I going to do to think about something different instead? So how do our thoughts influence our day-to-day experience? They are everything. Second objective, how can I handle challenge and difficulty in a positive way? Because there might be stuff that I just cannot change because it's outside my control. How can I handle that in a bit of a different way? And in fact, Alan Turing says that up to a point, it's better to just let the snags, the bugs, be there than to spend lots of time in design to ensure that there are none. So maybe your first step is just accepting that part of the wonder of the human brain is it can take you into some darker corridors that potentially are there to remind you of the lighter corridors. So we could spend a whole life trying to stop thinking negative, but actually there might be a quicker way to go about that. In fact, computers, there was a bit of a game changer that happened apparently a number of years ago, where what they realised was that setting two codes against each other is actually what creates the spark to get an alternative solution. So if you've just got something that is learning with what you're giving it, that potentially doesn't come up with a new idea. But these adversarial networks that were put together, where one bit of software is pitched against the other, actually create the friction to create the spark for creativity. So it's the platform rather than the obstacle. And so being challenged is often when our thoughts get an airing and we increase our level of awareness and intelligence anyway. So this is what the kind of algorithm looks like. So this is the kind of the straightforward bit that we put in. And then there would be something else pitched in against it to then come up with some fine tuning. Now I look at that and that reminds me of a coaching situation. You've got one person sitting there who's got their train of thought, and actually the role of the other is to allow the other person to discriminate, well, what's true and what's not. So if you're finding that not only are you kind of thinking on a bit of a negative track, but it's also been your thoughts have only had your own thinking, then what could you do right now to pick up the phone or interact with someone else just to get an other perspective? Because even the machines are showing us that in order to come up with truly creative, useful concepts, you've got to be pitched against another. So adverse conditions are actually desirable for a computer because it gets it thinking more creatively. The second thing maybe to have a think about is, how do I ensure that I don't have too much noise? So I've got some competing information that allows me to think of another way around something, but not too much noise. And even just 5 minutes a day, peace, just to think, can help reduce overload, which can impact our logic. So what can I do to reduce the noise that's either inside my head or around me today? Because look at what happens when a computer's given too much noise. On the left-hand side, a computer will say, this is Google's imaging database. So with 57.7% confidence, the machine knew, yep, that is definitely Google. But attack it with lots of noise, don't quite know what this means, but it's lots of noise, and then actually it spangles the algorithms a bit, so then actually the computer is then saying, no, it's definitely a gibbon to 99.3% confidence. So this is how potentially a software program might be hacked. So how might my thinking be hacked? Whereas I might say, yeah, you know, I'm about 60% confident that the team will like me, put in a load of noise that goes around my head, and I'm now 99% confident that the team hate me and they're not going to accept me when then we go back. So there's a huge amount of benefit from having an alternative view, but within reason, because too much noise, it can actually spangle our head a little bit because we haven't got room to think. Just like a computer, what can we do to reduce the amount of noise in or around me today? So when's a moment later on today you could just have 5 minutes to yourself just to be able to clear your thoughts a bit. And the third thing maybe to have a think about the role of adversity is to prize your intuition with this. So these adverse conditions will be generating all sorts of information that we'll be processing. And I guess this is a nod to prizing your gut feel, because machines may have neural networks, but they don't have tummies and they don't have that gut feel, because not all logic is a total positive. The question, does this feel right or not, is always a powerful one to ask. And here's a classic story that always stuck with me. I picked up at a conference a couple of years ago about what happens if you only allow machines to make, for example, commercial decisions. So check out this book, The Making of a Fly. And what would you expect to pay for that book? Oh, it's an American book, I don't know, $10, $15. Well, what happened on the Amazon marketplace about 5 years ago, before there was more human intervention put in, is, unbeknownst to Amazon, there were two competing software programs. So one was an algorithm looking at find out the price of a book and then add 10%. And then the competing algorithm was find the price of a book and then undercut by 20%. So however the maths was, it basically meant that these algorithms were continuing to compete against each other. And what happened within about 6 hours of that book being used as a book that undergraduates needed to buy in the States, so it was linked to a syllabus, and within about 5 hours the price of that book had exceeded what have we got there, $23 million, because two algorithms were just purely going on the logic and the maths, and they were pitching against each other. And before you know it, one night the book had gone from $19 to nearly $24 million. And it was a classic case study looking at what happens if you only let machines make gut feel reasonable decisions. Actually, the role of that human to kind of go, no one's going to pay $23 million for that book. They might for that piece of art, but they might not for that book. So adverse conditions will be creating all sorts of new experiences for us and thinking processes. So yes, although we can channel the machine cleanness of thinking, actually there's also a lot of benefit in listening to that gut feel about what feels right. Because if we leave it just to logic, sometimes we can get some unusual, unwanted outcomes that come from it. So how can I handle challenge and difficulty in a positive way? Well, adverse conditions actually enables machine to be more intelligent, where an adversarial network is pitched where it's one against the other. So often adverse conditions create the most creativity. Just think about how the creative ways you're keeping your mind entertained right now will give you an insight as to how necessity can breed creativity. Creating the space to think well each day, though, because too much noise, it can spangle our thinking, just like with the computer. So just 5 minutes to defrag and reboot, to be able to have a fresh perspective around something, and prizing your intuition, because not all computer logic is always positive. Asking yourself, does this feel right for me, might be able to give another slant on how you might handle challenge. Ending on Alan Turing, though, sometimes those snags are there to remind us that we are human and that we're not actually robots. So how do I keep my brain in optimum condition? How do I look after it? Well, if we were to channel the words of Alan Turing here, unless we're communicating with a computer and saying exactly what we want, then trouble is bound to result. So if you think about some of the funny things that happen with voice activated technology, that kind of, shows us that you sometimes have to ask exactly what you want. Likewise with our human brain, if I'm a little bit kind of vague, as in I think I want a happy life, but I'm not quite sure what it is that's going to enable me to be happy today, then potentially I could get myself into a bit of trouble. So step one, our brains keep fresh through learning and variety. And there's something I stumbled across a number of years ago called neurobics, which is basically taking your brain out for a run each day, getting some fresh air to your brain. I lose track on the chemical words for it, but every time that our brains are thinking and generating a new thought process, it stimulates some brain fertilizer that gets us thinking. I'm going to be restarting the piano soon, and I just know it is going to enable me to feel more positive and more smart, because my brain is going to have to be thinking again in a way that it hasn't thought for years. And activating our different senses each day keeps our brains learning. Imagine that this field here, you've got the pathways that were designed by the developers. So that was your early years. So I brush my teeth, I comb my hair, I do all these robotic tasks that's part of your day-to-day habits. But every time, just like residents of this estate, take unofficial, informal walks to go and drop in on someone and keep the community close, each time we do that, we are generating a new pathway in our brain. And the cells that fire together wire together. So someone that can speak 7 languages fluently, their brain will look different than someone like me who's just got a mono language. The brain of a black taxi driver, the hippocampus area, I think, which is the bit that holds all that geospatial knowledge, weighs 20% heavier than someone who hasn't done the knowledge. So the physical weight of the knowledge in our brain carries that mass. So activating our different senses each day keeps our brains learning. And one of the challenges when we're in restricted conditions or through a period of transformational change is that we can become a bit too routine-y, which actually can mean our brain kind of gets a little bit stuck. So how could you take your brain out for a run today, just doing something a bit different, just because the learning and variety is something that a computer wouldn't naturally be thinking about. All it will do will just keep on with the program that it's been programmed to. Nurturing our brain, finding out that the brain weighs 2% of my body mass, or probably about 1% now based on what I've been eating, yet it consumes 20% of our calorific intake, is a real reminder that actually we are what we eat. So even thinking about feeding our brain with, you know, healthy stuff, as opposed to some of the fruit-based drinks that some of us might have been consuming during lockdown. So we know what's good for us, and it's not just our physical, but it's also our cognitive as well, because 1/5 of what we consume each day is what is fueling our brain. And the third thing maybe is, so no matter how old you are, no matter how young you are, age and outlook is just a mindset. We are never too old to learn. A machine is not even aware of how long it's been going for. And in fact, its internal clock will keep ticking, even if it's been on standby for years. So just like the machines, our brains can learn and adjust. It's got no concept of old age. It is just living. And so thinking about the neuroplasticity, they call it, which is the fact that our brain is able to make new connections regardless of how old we are, and it can reorganize itself with forming some new neural connections. So how we adjust and respond doesn't matter how old we are. This is new for us all. What an opportunity for us to keep our brain fresh by thinking differently. So how do I keep my brain in optimum condition? Well, first off, telling it that you want to look after it might be a good place to start, because how we communicate with ourselves, well, we are the everlasting relationship, aren't we, with the first and last person we'll ever be aware of. Our brain's keeping fresh through learning and variety, so thinking aerobics. Nurturing our brain, it weighs such a tiny amount of our body mass, but consumes 1/5 of everything that we consume each day in terms of our calorific intake. And age and outlook is just a mindset. We are never too old to learn. Just like the machines, there is no concept of early or end of life. It's just there doing its thing, keeping itself in optimal condition. So, big topic. I wanted to look at a classic topic of human performance and positivity, but rework it in a bit of a quirky way, look at this emerging world of technology around us. The speed of human thinking can roughly be equated to 10 million billion primary thoughts per second. That's almost 10 million times faster than the processor of a PC. Wow. We are phenomenal in terms of how quick our brains work. And the whole sentiment of this webinar has been, is it working for you or is it working against you in terms of keeping positive through adversity? For this period of transformation is testing us and developing strengths in ways that there was no training course this time just 3 months ago. We are having to learn how to keep positive during conditions and situations that you may be new to you and certainly new to others around us as well. And yet the full power of our human thinking still remains a mystery. So what will we learn about ourselves through these unprecedented times? For a team to emerge well, it's going to be key to practice some thinking and communication concepts that are likely to stretch us. We might have to think differently about how we vent and how we interact with people so that our thinking helps other people to stay positive as well. And honing these skills now can only be of benefit as we emerge even more skilled to maximise our potential alongside technology in the years ahead, because the technology in our lives won't be harking back to the obstacles we found now. They will be using it as a learning experience to get smarter and smarter. So, just like these standing stones of Stonehenge here, 5,000 years they've been there, there'll be some ways of keeping positive and staying positive that have served you well for many years. So how can you ensure you keep on with those? Likewise, might be an opportunity to refresh some things and be like a fox and maybe adapt to be able to handle this emerging world for all of us. So how am I going to ensure that my daily thought processes are working for me and not against me? A machine will be checking the quantity and the quality of the input that it processes. So how could we do the same? How can I reframe the challenges and adversities to become platforms to be more creative rather than barriers? For adversary and adversarial networks was the game changer for machines to become more creative and more intelligent. And how am I going to look after my brain now for a future that maximizes my phenomenal potential? And so here we are at the end of webinar 14. Keep human, stay foxy. I'll see you at the next one.